Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. Cam, for many weeks now, we've been talking about the anticipated Israeli invasion of Rafah. Is this it, or is this something else?
Well, Claire, it looks like it will be the start of the invasion of Rafah. Things are changing literally by the hour as we speak. But what we had in the last 24 hours or so was the order to, or the request, I should say, by the Israelis for people to evacuate parts of Rafah.
We're learning from our content partners over at the Associated Press, the Israeli Army Monday ordering tens of thousands of people in the southern city of Rafah there in the Gaza Strip along the border with Egypt to start evacuating from the area, signaling that a long-promised battleground invasion there could be imminent.
Now, that was widely interpreted as the first move to an actual invasion, a ground invasion of Rafah. Subsequent to that, we did have some limited Israeli strikes in eastern Rafah. And subsequent to that, we've now heard that Israeli forces have taken over the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing that goes into Egypt. So if you put all this together, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that this is the start of the invasion of Rafah. But it's very early days, and it's hard to tell exactly how they will go into Rafah and to what degree this will intensify in the days ahead.
Israel's attack on Gaza has basically swept from north to south, and as it's prepared to attack each area in turn, it's warned civilians to get out of the way. It's said that its stated goal is to eliminate Hamas's senior leadership and to eliminate the tunnel network that they use under Gaza. That has effectively swept a large proportion of the population of Gaza into Rafah, hasn't it?
It has, and this is the great problem that Israel now faces militarily, diplomatically and politically, is that there's about 1.4 million displaced people in Rafah. They're displaced because of the war in the north. They've come down. They're sheltering there. It's the last big stronghold in Gaza that hasn't fallen to the Israelis. And so Israel has a terrible choice here of whether to go in to Rafah to take out the 4 battalions of Hamas operatives, which it says are still operating there. That's the last organised resistance of Hamas is in Rafah. But in doing so, of course, the civilian death toll potentially could be massive. So it's really caught in a bind. And that's why we haven't seen any action for about 6 or 7 weeks. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been talking about, yes, we're going into Rafah. Yes, we're going in regardless of what happens. But we actually haven't seen that happen. Instead, we've seen the Western allies of Israel, especially the US and Australia as well, warn against going in unless there is a really strategic plan to move the population out and minimise civilian casualties.
Is there anywhere for the population to go, Cam?
Well, this is the question. Israel has identified a couple of places just to the northwest of Rafah, very open desert, no real infrastructure, not a great place to put people, but nevertheless, obviously a better place to put people or try to put people than the actual city of Rafah. So while there's a lot of concern about the sort of sanitation and ability of people to go en masse to this area, it's certainly a safer place than Rafah. But whether people go in the large numbers, Claire, remains to be seen. Obviously, a lot of the population a little bit caught between going and not going, because actually moving can be dangerous as well. So it'll be really interesting to see in the next few days what proportion of the population of Rafah chooses to move out and which proportion chooses to stay.
Hamas took hundreds of hostages when it launched its October 7 attack on Israel. Should we assume now that those hostages are in and around Rafah?
The Israelis appear to believe that they are around Rafah rather than held in different places, but of course they could be scattered around in all sorts of places. There's about 130 odd hostages, of which about 95 are believed to be alive. And that's been one of the issues which has delayed, if you like, the Israeli move on Rafah, because there's been talks brokered by Qatar between Hamas and Israel about a hostage deal. Israel is willing to have a 6-week ceasefire in return for the release of about 30 or 40 hostages. The sticking point is that Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. So the two countries cannot agree on that. And interestingly, just the day before Israel called for the evacuation of parts of Rafah, the talks on the hostage deal stalled, which has raised speculation that is Israel doing this to try and force Hamas to the table again or not?
In regard to those hostages, Cam, why is 30 the number that Israel thinks it might be able to get out at this point? Why not all 90 or 95 who they think are still alive?
Because they're being graded by the 30 or so that they're talking about women, children, and people who are ill. So there's another level, if you like, of hostages, which are Israeli army or healthy young men. And they're the ones who are the hardest to negotiate for. Hamas has said they're not going to release those. They will only release the women, children, and the ones who are sick at this point in time. So that's the argy-bargy that's going between the two countries. There's no real suggestion that Hamas would be releasing all of them in the short term at all. And I guess from Hamas's point of view, unfortunately, that would remove some of their bargaining chips as well. So it doesn't look like that's a likely scenario.
Coming up, what combat in Rafah could look like. Don't forget, the Australian subscribers get this kind of up-to-the-minute reporting and analysis every day. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au. And we'll be back after this break. Cam, the Israeli attack on Gaza started out like a siege, an old-fashioned kind of siege. Then it turned into hand-to-hand, almost guerrilla combat in an urban setting, in the streets of places like Khan Yunis, as Israeli forces tried to take on militants but protect the civilian population. What is that warfare going to look like as they go into Rafah, do you think?
Yeah, that is the critical question, Claire. I think it's very difficult for Israel to fight the war in Rafah in the same way that they fought the war in the rest of Gaza. They started off, as you know, with very broad aerial attacks in northern Gaza, which I think ended up killing a lot more civilians than they'd expected, and certainly the world expected. But that's what they did as a prelude to a ground operation, which was quite successful in clearing a lot of Hamas out of northern Gaza. But because of the large population in Rafah of displaced people, I don't think they can have the same sort of tactics. I don't think they can have that broad-based, full-on invasion with an air attack and a big ground attack without having terrible civilian casualties, which I think would make Israel an international pariah. I just don't think they would go down that route. So what I think is much more likely is that Israel will have a more targeted strikes to Rafah, limited, probably with special forces in sections of the city at a certain time. That way they can minimise civilian casualties and still kill Hamas operatives. But that sort of operation is more dangerous for the Israelis. It's a more dangerous situation for their soldiers, and it puts them at greater risk. So that will be the debate as to exactly not whether Israel goes into Rafah, because I think they definitely are going to. It's how they go into Rafah.
And what would victory look like in Rafah, Cam? How will Israel know when it has eliminated the people who it wants to eliminate, as opposed to them just going into hiding, going into those tunnels and, I guess, flying the white flag until Israel retreats?
It's going to be very difficult for Israel to declare in any convincing way that they've absolutely won, because they're not going to be able to kill every single Hamas fighter. There are still Hamas fighters in very small groups in the north of Gaza. But this is the thing, you can't kill every fighter. Hamas is also an ideology as well. It's a very difficult concept to wipe out entirely. So it's not at all clear exactly at what point Israel would declare a total victory. That's just one of those questions that we just don't know the answer to at this point. But it's very hard to see a very clear endpoint here.
In terms of Hamas's goals, Cam, the attack on Israel on October 7 was obviously designed to provoke some kind of reaction from Israel. That has now, of course, happened. We've seen a lot of world sentiment turn against Israel, concerns being raised about the way Israel has conducted the war, even from people who are pro-Israel. What does victory look like for Hamas, do you think?
I think victory for Hamas is pretty much what it expected all along, and that is for Israel to continue to pound Gaza, to continue to have large numbers of civilians killed, and to continue to be isolated in the world community, even more so by its allies. I mean, I think Hamas wants to wreak intergenerational problems on Israel. And obviously doesn't care about the people of Palestine. I mean, if it did, it wouldn't have done the October 7 attack, because it would have known the sort of ferocity of the retribution from Israel, and it wouldn't have used people as human shields by hiding under hospitals and schools, etc., etc. So I think for Hamas, an attack on Rafah, again, just plays into their hands to a degree, but you can fully understand why the Israelis want to go into Rafah. I mean, it would make no sense for them to have fought the war up to this point if their entire aim is to destroy Hamas and simply stop at the last stronghold. It would just make no sense. So I think the calculation as far as Israel is concerned is how to go into Rafah, how to be successful without further alienating themselves on the world stage.
And what about war on other fronts for Israel, Cam? We've seen rocket fire over its borders in the north and in the east since the beginning of this conflict. What do you think is going to happen in coming days in relation to that?
The situation as far as the war broadening has not unfolded as a lot of people thought it might. We had that very strange, almost puppet master clash between Iran and Israel, where Iran delivered a whole lot of missiles towards Israel. They nearly all got shot down, and Israel just did one very small strike back on Iran.
Breaking news: in a major escalation of the crisis in the Middle East, Iran has started a direct attack on Israel by launching dozens of drones to attack targets there. Iran has said it wants revenge for a suspected Israeli attack almost 2 weeks ago on its consulate in Damascus.
What we have had is daily strikes in the north between Hezbollah in Lebanon and northern Israel, but those haven't flared up to be anything more than daily nuisance strikes, really. The West Bank has been very unstable, but again, that hasn't flared up into anything worse than instability and sporadic violence. So I think the big picture is that, thankfully, there hasn't really been a spreading of the war beyond Gaza. And at this point in time, it doesn't look like there will be, but it's the Middle East, Claire. It could all change on a dime.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. You can follow this developing story at theaustralian.com.au and come back tomorrow for more of The Front.